Hey everybody, it's Professor Edwards. I miss being there with you guys. I hope Dr. Keith is having fun with you and that you're being nice, polite, and respectful students that I know you are. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Introduction to Digital Photography. It's time that we start playing with our DSLR cameras. So I wanted to give you a brief, abbreviated PowerPoint presentation for some of the basic terms that you're going to need to know in order to set your DSLRs for your assignments. Technology, DSLR, megapixels, image stabilization, dust reduction, aperture, ISO, shutter speed, live view, sensor, facial recognition. What are all these terms? What does it all mean? And more importantly, you're probably wondering, why does it matter to me? Essentially, we're going to be using DSLRs for this class for the next couple of weeks, and you need to kind of know what types of digital cameras are available, what are out there. There are three main classifications of digital cameras. You have your point and shoots, you have your prosumer models, and you have your digital SLRs. Point and shoot digital cameras, P&Ss, are commonly referred to as consumer digital cameras, and they represent roughly 90% of all digital cameras on the market. They're typically small, compact, and lightweight, targeted at a broad majority audience. They're affordable, they're typically very friendly to use, and image quality has improved drastically over the last 10 years. So these are the little models that you pick up, and you can buy them at any store, like even from anything from a CVS to a Walgreens to Target, and they are getting less and less expensive every year. Prosumer digital cameras are a common term to use to describe an advanced model of a point and shoot. They're now also used to describe entry-level, low-level DSLRs. They're similar in shape and appearance to digital SLRs. They typically have some sort of extended zoom range, so you have a little bit of range as far as capturing zoom. Typically, they combine user-friendly point-and-shoot features with a little more advanced manual features, and they cost a little more than point-and-shoot models. These are the ones you will find at places like Best Buy and Target, anywhere from like the $400 to $700 range. And then we get to what we are going to be using for this class, our digital SLRs. SLR stands for single lens reflex. Digital SLRs have larger sensors, which result in greater image quality. They tend to favor manual control, which is going to be very important for all of us. And what you're going to be learning is how to set your cameras manually, how to set up shots manually. And they lack many of the automatic features that are found on the point and shoots. They tend to be larger and a bit heavier, and they have this awesome ability to be able to change the lens packages and lenses. So you can have a camera body and you can have an assortment of lenses to take different style photos. So what is the real difference between a digital SLR and a point and shoot camera? Good question. The short answer is image quality. But why? How can a 6 or 8 megapixel DSLR take a better picture than a 10 megapixel point and shoot? Because when it comes to image quality in pixels, size matters. How digital sensors work in cameras. Each digital image is made from millions of tiny squares, and these are known as pixels. I'm sure you guys being digital generation know what pixels are. As you can see in the photo of the deer, I've gone in, there's a box around his ear, and on the left, you'll see the box. And on the right, I've gone in and zoomed in so you see the actual individual pixels of the deer's ear, the individual pixels that make up the image. Essentially, an image is recorded by tiny micro lenses, known as pixels, which make up the camera's sensor. And Something we're going to talk about later throughout the semester, especially when we get into editing software programs, is that all pixels are not created equal. A digital sensor is essentially made up of millions of tiny micro lenses, and these pixels are analog devices which record the light and color data. Larger sensors logically contain larger pixels, which are much better at collecting this data, and that is what the DSLRs are using. As I said, we're going to discuss pixels more in depth when we get into the editing software. But as you can see, the comparisons of just like a compact camera sensor as opposed to an SLR camera sensor. The larger sensors contain larger pixels, which in the end are better at collecting the data and give you a better image. So what are some digital camera features and technologies? Talking about megapixels, determining the total size, dimension of the image recorded by the camera. More megapixels does not always mean that you'll get a better picture. Digital image dimensions do not equal print dimensions. Again, this is something we will cover, especially when we get into editing and Photoshop and stuff like that. For example, a full quality image from an 8 megapixel camera will produce a digital image measuring around 9 by 14 inches, but print standards say you should not print to a photo quality any larger than 8 by 10. You're going to get blowout, you're going to get pixelization. If you ever tried to copy an image off of the internet, if you print it out or try to do the quality photo print, it's not going to look right. Or you drop it into a website, it's not the right pixel or frame rate. It's going to look distorted. So we'll talk about all kinds of fun things like pixels and codecs when we get into the digital side of our editing softwares. This is just a brief chart so you can see megapixels versus print size. And if you look around 8 to 10 right there, you measure out at getting around an 8 by 10 print quality size for what you would need to print for like a decent looking image. So movement compensation, what are you doing? How do you get started taking your photos? Movement compensation, what does that mean? It refers to the camera's ability to correct small movements by the user, that's you, while you're taking your pictures, in order to reduce the blur, which is caused by something in the industry you call camera shake. It's camera shake. You're going to hear a lot about that word, camera shake. Camera shake, especially movement compensation, can be useful in low light situations or when you're using telephoto. One thing to realize when you are entering the production world, people are very loyal to certain brands of cameras and lenses and equipment. Movement compensation, this is just an idea to give you how movement compensation is represented differently by different companies. Essentially, that just means each individual company has its own name for what they refer to as movement compensation. For example, in our class, we are using Canons. So I tend to use Canons. In work, I've used other camera, like larger JVCs and Panavision cameras. But for what we're using here, Canon. I know movement stabilization as IS, image stabilization. If you have a Nikon, you're going to know image stabilization as VR, vibration reduction. Same goes with the Pentax and then the Sony's. Sony is infamous for its triple S's, which is they call their version of image stabilization super steady shot. So something to be aware of is that if you have your own DSLR camera, you're welcome to bring it and use it on your own. But just know that I and the rest of the class will be using the Canons, and I know Canon terminology. So dust reduction. Dust and DSLR do not play well together. Dust is more of a problem in DSLRs due to you can change lenses. So once dust gets on your sensor, if you've removed your lenses and are changing out your lens packages, you have to be careful because dust is very difficult to remove. And the sensors in the camera will start reading those little dust particles. Dust reduction is essentially a mechanism which shakes the camera's sensor to free any clinging dust particles. Your DSLRs will do this for you. They have dust reduction settings. There are special anti-static coatings and filters can be used, but if you're on a shoot, just be careful. If you're going to change out a lens or you think you have dust in it, first thing you know is, you take your lens, remove it from the body. The next thing you know, you've put it on the back of a dusty truck bed or something, and then you've got dust. And when that happens, we have to generally take it to the Coke's Camera in downtown Macon and have a lovely gentleman named Ken Krakow there remove the dust, and it's costly. So I do ask that if you do take the camera bodies off and if you're going to change the lens, be careful. So what constitutes getting a good shot? There are hundreds of factors which go into making a photo good. And essentially, it's still a relative term because what is good to me may not be good to you, and good to one person is not good to someone else. But for our purposes, what we're going to refer to in the sense of getting a good shot means you get a correct exposure. So what's exposure? A correct or good exposure occurs when you maintain as much detail as possible in both the very bright parts, the highlights, as well as the very dark parts referred to as shadows in your images. How much of a range in which you can capture detail from light to dark in your images is referred to as your dynamic range. As you're about to see, there can be many correct or good exposures, but there are specifically 3 factors which influence the exposure of your images. And I cannot stress this enough. You're going to need to know these three factors. These 3 factors are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let's talk about shutter speed for a minute. Shutter speed refers to how long the shutter in the camera is open, exposing the image sensor to light. Essentially, shutter speed is simply how long the camera sees the picture. We measure shutter speed in seconds, from 30 down to 1/8000th. As you can see, I've got a couple examples here of shooting on fast shutter speeds, 600 and higher. If you shoot on fast shutter speeds, what this gives you the ability to do is essentially stop motion. It freezes your subject. As you see, I found this lovely photo which has the guy on the surfboard where it's stopping motion. It freezes the subject while he is surfing. Same with the kids jumping. They're actually frozen while they're in motion. And this is something that's used a lot in sports, the ability to use fast shutter speeds to capture things like the football game, baseball, soccer, things like that. We're going to play with some shutter speeds. A slow shutter speed, on the other hand, can be used to portray movement or speed. So if fast is freezing things, slow shutter speed is going to allow you to manipulate that portrayal of movement or speed, where you see the actual movement of this water coming down this waterfall, or the runners running. You actually are seeing their movement with a slower shutter speed. And then you have your very slow shutter speeds, 5 seconds or slower, which can be used in very low light situations. This is done to obtain correct exposure or achieve, especially in cinema and film, a dramatic effect. As you see in the photo of a highway set to very, very, very low speeds. That's how filmmakers achieve that dramatic effect of cars on a freeway. It's got that very neon look where you see the lights of the cars going back and forth. So something to be aware of with your shutter speed, as your shutter speed decreases, your chances of getting a blurry image increase, because logically, if you're shooting At that speed, you're going to have to hold your camera steady for a longer period of time. So just beware, as your shutter speed decreases, the chances of you getting a blurry image increase because you're holding your camera steady for a longer period of time. Which brings us to aperture. An aperture is defined as a hole or opening through which light is emitted. Inside the camera lens is a system of blades which open and close to increase or decrease the opening through which light passes into the camera. Aperture is also, you may know it, you may be more familiar with it as your f-stop. And aperture is generally, if you see something written out or directions, aperture is usually represented in Fs. They start at f1.8, f2, f4, f5.6, and they can go on up. The smaller aperture number, the F number, means a wider opening and is referred to as a larger value. So a larger aperture of 2.0, a small aperture of 22. The wider the lens is open, the more light gets in, and you can use faster shutter speeds. As you see here, these are your basic f-stops. And as you can see, from your f2, where are your blades? What is it doing? Letting all the light in. f2, f4, you're getting the blades. f8, the blades are closing in. And then when you get up to f16, you have very little light that's going to be coming in. So what is important? Because aperture also controls your depth of field, which refers to how much of your image is in your focus. A wide aperture, which is a small number, wide aperture means a small f-stop number, will give you a shallow depth of field and can be used to isolate a subject. Take a look at the two balls of like twine material here. I found these from a photo website on B&H Photography. Shallow depth of field is f2.8. What do you see? What is in that image? You see the foreground. You see that one ball in front, and then you kind of have a grainy background. You have a wider depth of field with f-stop 32, and you have more in focus, more of an in focus depth of field. You see all three subjects in that one shot. ISO. ISO refers to your light sensitivity of the sensor. A high ISO value means the sensor will be more sensitive to light, meaning it will take less light to get the right exposure. This is similar to film speeds in 35mm film formats. Your ISO typically ranges from 100 to 6400, and now these are based on the Canons. Our Canons start at 100 and go to 100, 200, 400, and so on. Using a high ISO value causes the sensor to produce much more heat, which creates digital noise in the images. And what are we talking about when we talk about noise? We're talking about interference. Noise is similar to film grain and causes loss of fine detail in images. So it's much more visible in dark parts of an image and is generally going to get more noticeable when displayed on screen than in print. So noise is just that film grain and that loss of detail in your image. Some cameras claim to have digital image stabilization. This just means that the camera will automatically increase the ISO in order to allow for an adjusted faster shutter speed. Faster shutter speed will reduce the likelihood of camera shake, but ISO, when you get that high ISO number, is also more than likely going to result in you having a grainy image. And these are things you're going to play with in the next week doing exercises. So don't be overwhelmed that you're kind of like going, what does this all mean? You're going to be doing exercises in ISO next week to play with setting the ISO on the cameras. and you'll start seeing what we're talking about. We're talking about grainy images and overexposure, underexposure, where your gray areas are, shadows, and things like that. Finally, we come to a fourth element I want to go ahead and introduce you to, because this is going to be something that when you start with the actual cinema style cameras, it's going to be important. It's your white balance. White balance doesn't really affect your exposure. It just affects the appearance of colors in the image. Different light sources cast their own colors, which cannot usually be noticed with the naked eye. So white balancing, essentially the camera, when you white balance, the camera is compensating for the color cast of the light in order to reproduce the correct colors. For instance, if you're working with a cinema camera and you keep turning it on and off between shots, every time you turn that camera off, you need to hold up your card, your white balance card, which we will get in a few weeks, and you need to zoom in on it and out, zoom in and out to adjust, let the camera adjust its sensors to correct those colors. In white balancing, the color cast of light is referred to as its color temperature, and color temperature is rated in degrees Kelvin. Temperature ranges from cool to warm. Most digital cameras do have automatic white balance, but also specific options for different sources of light. In the coming weeks, we will be learning more about our light spectrum, our degrees Kelvin, where does ultraviolet versus gamma versus X-ray to sunlight and tungsten. What do all these mean? We're going to be studying that when we get to lighting. Your basic in-camera settings, your exposure modes on the Canons. There are different, several modes that are available, which offer a combination of automatic and manual control over the three elements of exposure. Auto is represented by your A, especially on the Canons, or simply the green square, which means you're fully automatically functioning. This creates a true point and shoot where the camera decides all the settings for you. But what have I just told you? We're shooting raw. For this class, you will not be using the A or autofocus. You're going to be shooting every assignment for now in manual mode. You have no other options. You're going to be shooting raw, unedited images for now. So shooting raw and shooting unedited, because it's important for you to learn to set your own aperture, to learn to set your shutter speeds, to learn to set your ISO. I cannot stress that enough. Because if you learn to set up your shots correctly now, and by practicing and do these exercises, this will save you so much time when you get to doing your larger projects for other digital media classes. This will save you time in post-production. If you set it up and can get it right the first time, it'll save you time in post. So your basic in-camera settings for your scene modes. Again, scene modes are basically fully automatic modes designed specifically for certain situations, and they are all over your cameras. They're typically place emphasis on one or more of your settings. You see the guy running for the sports setting, for portrait setting, for the mountain scene, for landscape. They have all of these settings for you to use, and most cameras have very similar scene modes. However, and once again I'm stressing, you're not to rely on these, as you will be shooting manual. So you have to be able to shoot manual, only manual. It's so tempting to turn that little portrait, little guy running on the side in your camera settings to get your action shot right now. But no, you're going to rely on simply manual shooting. And finally, let's go over quickly. We hit this the first week, our rule of thirds. As you remember, the rule of thirds is simply when you look through your viewfinder, you have your quadrants of your viewfinder are divided into thirds. And where you have your bright crosshatches here, the red, are your main focal points within your rule of thirds. So take a look at this photograph that I'm about to show you and see if you can identify the rule of thirds in it. So our rule of thirds running our lines, where the tree sits, where the water line is, where the horizon is. Note when you start to line up your shots, be constantly in your mind thinking your rule of thirds. Rule of thirds. Again, the concept for rule of thirds is simple. Place your subject along the lines or near your intersecting points. For portraits, if you're going to shoot people, especially like portrait style for some of the exercises we're going to do, the eyes are often positioned along one of the horizontal lines, preferably near one of the power points. Those little cross hatches that were marked red to make the photograph more pleasing to look at and naturally draw attention to the eyes, so it doesn't feel awkward. It doesn't look like a mugshot rather than a portrait. Again, a couple of more illustration for rules of thirds. You will see the snail that's on the stalk of wheat over here. You have lines. Remember, we've been talking about lines, angles, rules of thirds, nice soft background. You have a foreground where the stalk and the snail are featured. And then over here in the photo of the building over the water, again, follow the lines. Remember, you brought in your photos that first week, and we talked a lot about lines and where our rules of thirds stood in our images. So these are some things to keep in mind when you're getting ready to go out and shoot your first assignment. So what do you do when you're done running through your rotations for the day? We're going to post-process and image management for now by having you guys set up Flickr accounts. They're free. It does require you to have a Yahoo address, which I know totally sucks. Who uses Yahoo in this day and age? But Flickr is a fantastic way to get your images uploaded for free into this digital space. They are offering a terabyte for free, a 1 terabyte of storage for free to upload your assignments on for now. We'll talk about Picasa maybe next week. Realizing a lot of you don't have access to Photoshop and the Adobe Creative Cloud suite at home, so I will talk about Picasa next week as far as a little free editing touch-up program when we get to touch-up and editing. Right now, no editing, shooting raw. And just Flickr is free to download, distributed by Google. It's simple, user-friendly, and I'm going to have you guys set those up if you have not already set them up now. You're going to have to upload your images you shoot today and then send the links so I can take a look at them. So anyway, thank you all for paying attention, listening. I miss you guys. I hope to see you in a few short weeks. Now let's get you guys broken out into your camera groups, and you're going to go outside. Dr. Keith has your assignment for practicing aperture and shutter speed tonight. If you have any questions, as always, you can call my office number, leave a message, I'll call you back, or send me a message on my MGA email address. Take care. Thanks, you guys.